This clip on how to turn day into night in Photoshop is from my weekly video podcast, Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. If you like what you see, make sure you click like, subscribe, click the notifications bell, and tell your friends about it too. Let's say we take a photo like this and we say we want to create a nighttime scene out of it. Okay, so what I'm going to do, let's open this in Photoshop. What I would do with something like this, just duplicate the layer because I always do. Just as a point of reference, if you're editing photos, I always feel duplicate your first layer before you start doing any kind of editing, because if you mess it up a bit, you've always still got the original that you can go back to without having to click undo or run back through the history for miles. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to zoom in to about here. I'm then going to use the lasso tool for quickness here. I'm just going to use the polyagonal one, which allows me to do square lines. And because the window is kind of square, I can do that. So that's selected that area. I'll hold down my shift button so I can now select another area as well. And I'm going to do that and that and that, and then come across to here. So I've now got two little areas, and I'm going to create a new layer. And on that layer, I'm going to create a kind of a pale yellow. So up here, just something like that, kind of, because this is going to be light coming from the window. And then I'm going to, so put that back up to 100%, paint that. Okay, so that now is going to be light coming from the window later on. It looks a bit odd now, okay, but I've got that on a separate layer. Now, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to darken down the scene. So say if I go to the curves and I grab the top bit here and just drag that down and drag it down and drag it down and drag it down, now it's becoming darker. Now, if I go all the way down, it becomes black. So I'm going to pull it back up to something like that. We're trying to make it dark, but not too dark. And then what I'm going to do, this yellow line, actually, I'm going to make sure is above. So now it's starting to look, you can see, that it's looking very roughly like light kind of coming out of her. Now, this still has, even though it's dark, it's still got a lot of the colour. If we're thinking about, imagine we're trying to create a kind of slightly more moonlit scene, because this is in sunlight, we've got a little bit of shadow cast, so we may as well try and make that moonlight. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come back to this layer, and let's go for hue saturation, and I'm going to colorize. So that's making it a single colour, and it's automatically defaulting to a kind of brown. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this over into the kind of blue. So we tend to think of it as a moonlight. Now, that in itself, the whole thing wouldn't be blue. You would still get a touch of colour if it was a full moon. So I'm just going to drag the opacity down, up, bring it around. So it's something kind of like that. Okay, maybe a little bit more, until I kind of feel that it's more of a kind of moonlight feel to it. Now, what I might also decide to do, if I go back to these curves, is I want to get a couple of little lighter patches on it. If that moon was hitting here, so I'm going to drop that down to something like 26%, and sorry, turn that to black, and just create like a little bit of, just slightly undo that, but only on the bits where the light might be falling itself. Maybe a little bit on that's maybe too much. Just take that down a little bit more. So I'm not doing it on the sides. Maybe I will actually just take up the highlights of this little bit of tree or something like that, I think. And then what I will also do is I will do a slight little burst over that window. Now, so now we've got a sort of slightly more kind of interesting thing. Now, with this layer, we've now got these lights. They still look just like blocks sitting there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the interaction of the layer. Now, this is normal. Now I can come down, I can darken, light, color burn, all sorts of things here. And let's say I get to color dodge, linear light, linear light, or vivid light. Vivid light's quite interesting. Vivid light is actually showing through some of the stuff that's actually behind the window as well. So that's making it, but it's got a bit of a red glow. What I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate that layer again. Rather than having a vivid light, this one I'm going to do a sort of soft light, maybe. overlay, soft light, or screen. Let's maybe do a screen, but then reduce it down a little bit. So now we've got it sort of a little bit more yellow, something like that. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate that layer again. I'm going to stick it above the top, and now what I'm going to do with this light, this level, do that as normal, I'm going to blur it. So if I go to blur, Gaussian blur, and what that's doing, you can see is, let's tell you what, let me cancel that, let me just come in close so you can actually see what's happening when we blur it. So if I go to filter, blur, Gaussian or Gaussian blur, you can see it's creating a little bit of a glow. And the more I come out, it kind of, now if I go too far, you don't notice it. So what you're looking for is something where you're getting a bit of a glow, but you can still kind of see through behind. So it's soft and subtle, maybe something like that. And so now we're getting to this point where it's now looking like it's much more like a kind of moonlit thing with light coming out of the window. Now I've got something like that, merge that all into one layer, and then I can finally go into Camera Raw and do a few of the usuals where maybe we put in a little bit more of a vignette. Optics, there we go, vignette, and come in here and maybe grab the clarity slider and drag that up a bit, something like that. So now we have our haunted house kind of thing. So we've still got tiny little bits of colour, but there's kind of that desaturated nighttime moonlight kind of look with glow coming from the windows of the turret. Now, if I wanted, I could have gone in and I could have selected all of the windows and done exactly the same effect, so it looked like there's light coming out of all of the windows.